Hi, this is Sean D'Souza, and you're listening to the 3-Month Vacation Podcast. This podcast isn't some magic trick about how to work less. Instead, it's about how to really enjoy the work that you do and to enjoy your vacation time. Hi, I'm Sean D'Souza, and you're listening to the 3-Month Vacation. Recently, we've been having a bit of a problem with our bialetti. If you don't know what a bialetti is, it is an Italian stovetop coffee maker and uses pressure in order to brew coffee. Well, it worked fine until recently, and now it seems to get stuck. There is something wrong with that adjustment. And this is the kind of adjustment that we have when we're jumping between tasks. As we go through the day, we seem to lose momentum. There almost seems to be an inordinate amount of time wasted every time you're switching tasks. Maybe you've been working on project A for an hour and now you need to go to project B. Even though the skill sets required for each project are similar, you find yourself dawdling between the tasks, often doing mindless work, getting distracted by the internet until you snap out of it. And then you get to work on the next thing. And sometimes you lose 10 minutes and sometimes an hour goes by without you noticing. The question is, how do you readjust? How do you get back into that groove when you're jumping from task to task? In today's episode, we're going to look at 3 things. The first concept is energy black holes. The second is discipline versus deadline. And finally, how limitations create superior work. Let's start out with the first one, which is energy black holes and why they exist. What's the difference between 4 a.m. and 4 p.m.? If you ask me personally, it's a world of a difference. At 4 a.m., I'm raring to go. I can write an article, I can draw cartoons, or I can write War and Peace. At 4 p.m., I'm a shadow of my 4 a.m. self. I'm distracted, bored, bouncing from Facebook to Pinterest, and randomly checking email in between. You know exactly where I'm going with this example, don't you? When we look at our world, we treat every hour exactly the same, and it's not. I'm like a vegetable right after lunch, which means that from around noon to well past 4 p.m., I'm better off going to the cafe, taking a nap, or doing something that most people would consider to be a waste of time, unproductive time. Yet, the reason why those unproductive hours can exist is because they're energy black holes. You and I need to know our energy black holes so that we can waste time effectively. Wasting time randomly doesn't bring us joy and warmth, but if we diligently go out for a coffee, take a nap, now that's pure strategy. Learning to recognize when you're hopeless at doing stuff is the key to getting stuff done and switching back to high gear. We may not realize it, but most of the day is split up into 3 sections. The first are the energy black holes, then the not so terrible hours, and finally, those hours when you're like Mick Jagger prancing on the stage. So which are your Mick Jagger moments? Do you have zones every single day that work well for you? We all do, don't we? My 4 a.m. is Renuka's 8 a.m. and yours might be 11 p.m. But we all know when we can be super duper fragilistic expialidocious, which means that we have to get most of our work done in those zones. Take a more strenuous activity like writing an article or creating a new presentation, then you're going to need a full charge for those activities as they are more power hungry. Yet we struggle and we get distracted even when we're in the right zone and we're ready to go. A big chunk of that blame must go to lack of preparation. If you're about to write an article, do you have the outline in place? Do you have the opening story ready? What about the research that you need to put in the piece? If the prep work isn't in place, it's natural to start digging for a story or doing slightly pointless research. Your energy levels are starting to burn out because you're doing a low energy task. All of the mind-numbing stuff should have been kept for times when your energy is low and you couldn't care less if you found the right information or you didn't. When you use high-quality octane to drive a bullock cart, then you're not making the bullock cart go faster, but what you're doing is you're wasting the octane. Time management is something that we kind of buy into, but it's a slightly stupid concept. Time management works really well if every hour is identical in terms of energy. The way to work with your energy is to make sure that you know the black holes of energy. These black holes can be used very effectively to recharge, to nap, to take a walk, or simply doing low-level, mindless tasks. The middle ground is where your energy is not so great, but you can handle tasks that don't suck up all of that octane. And that leaves us with the high energy zones, which you don't want to waste because it feels really crappy when you waste all of that energy. And then you get a doom loop of lower energy. Now you're going to know when you have high energy, and you're going to know when you're going to have really crappy energy, and then there is in-between energy. But that doesn't mean that you're going to get anything done without a planning strategy. I spend a good chunk of my time in some sort of planning. Maybe I'm planning for a webinar or a podcast series or just the strategy for our business. I have to fit in all of that, as well as make sure that I get my watercolors done, cook breakfast and lunch, upload the photos to the photo book that I'm creating. And none of this is going to get done just by itself, without any sort of planning, without allocating those activities in different energy zones. If you and I are going to get any work done, we're going to have to plan and place all of those activities in their respective zones. And that's where every zone becomes useful to you. But at first, or rather as the first step, you have to get to know your black holes. Even if you nap or whittle away time, it's a good use of time. Because it's in the black hole zone that you also get to put together the plan, to do the preparation work. And then when your high energy kicks in, you're off like a rocket, finishing work in a fraction of the time. And now you have time to waste. Which is amazing, isn't it? Well, that brings us to the end of the first section of this podcast. It does take us to the second part, which is, wait a second, I can do all this energy stuff, but I'm still not disciplined. Let's find out the difference between discipline and deadline. If you look at disciplined people for inspiration, they will often mislead you. Take author Dan Brown, for example. He wakes up every day at 4 a.m., 365 days a year. Even on Christmas Day, he emphasizes. And if you look at the story of Mary Higgins Clark, you find a similar story of dedication. Her husband dies, she's left with young kids and an okay job. She rises a couple of hours before the kids do, and she writes her first novel. So when you look at Brown or Clark or any other writer or singer, what you get is an amazing story of discipline. But what we fail to see is they're only disciplined the first time around. When you're a nobody, it takes a mountain of discipline to create something that doesn't seem to have any commercial value. So if you're writing your first book, you're creating your first product, you're creating a course, there are no buyers in sight. So you've got to pour in all of that discipline. But once you sell that first product or service, you've got a list, you've got some publisher that wants a second book, you've got something happening, and now you're just meeting deadlines. Take a look at world champion Michael Phelps. For years, he did nothing but waddle in the pool like any other kid, trashing around in the water. But then his sisters, Whitney and Hillary, joined a local swim team, and then Whitney tried out for the US Olympic team, and she had to bail out because of injuries. But he got interested. Phelps got interested. And Bob Bowman, Phelps' coach, took him under his wing, and then he put him through an intense training regime, so that by 1999, Phelps had made the US national team, just the B team, not the A team, mind you. But now, Phelps was doomed. He was battling a deadline. He had to make it to the A team, then he had to win a medal. Much like a writer who has no success and then writes a bestseller, or a company that sells no product, but suddenly starts to dominate the market, the very act of putting the next win out is what drives the discipline. Which isn't to say that these writers, swimmers, or business people don't feel the same dread of having to meet deadlines. Yet, it's not entirely discipline that counts. It's the deadline that looms ahead. Once you've made the promise, sold the rights, etc., you have to deliver. Which is precisely when you realize that you cannot burn through energy. You need all of that energy to get to the endpoint, whatever that endpoint may be. And this is where time steps in. Time management is that deadline. It's the ticking clock. It's the whole zone between when you've got the assignment and when you have to deliver. In effect, deadlines bring discipline. We see successful people as being disciplined, and let's not denigrate their dedication, but without a deadline, they're often as lazy as you and me. They use their energy badly, they get distracted, they don't achieve much, which in turn tells us that we need to do something similar. We need our first little win. Then we have an audience, maybe a really small audience. We make a promise to that audience. We may sell a book, a course, a webinar series, anything at all. And then you're fighting a deadline. And then you automatically have discipline. It's game on. That brings us to the end of the second part. In the first part, we looked at those energy black holes. In the second part, we looked at deadlines versus discipline. Here's the third part, which is how limitations create superior work. If you live in a congested city, you would have noticed more roads being built. And we automatically assume, more roads means less congestion, the traffic will flow better, and of course none of that happens. When you put on more roads, you get more traffic. Really, the problem isn't solved. Instead, what if we were to restrict the roads? What if half of the lanes were just for bicycles? Almost instantly, you'd see a greater number of people using public transport, or many of them adopting bicycles and electric bikes as a form of transport because it's safer and it's faster to get going. On the other side, all those cars are clogged up. On your side, you're just flying through. And what you'd find is that people going on random trips in cars would start to drop quite dramatically. We didn't change the roads, we didn't change the infrastructure, but we created limitations. Similarly, you have to have limitations when you're doing your work. You're not going to get more hours. You're not going to get more days or weeks. And the longer and harder you work, the less productive you get. No scientist needs to do a 5-year study to tell you that you can only work at an optimum level for so long and then you start wasting time. The nasty part about all of this distraction and time wastage is that it's self-perpetuating. The more time you waste, the worse you feel, and it takes an enormous amount of energy to get back on the track again. Unless, of course, you spend less time. Spending less time on an activity seems to sound like a half-baked exercise. If it takes you an hour to write an article, how could you possibly take 45 minutes to do the same thing? Except you're not doing the same thing, are you? When we're given a limited amount of space, we tend to get more creative. Let's take an example. Around last year, this time, my big boast was that I'd work for a month on every single presentation. It sounds dedicated, doesn't it? And far better than the statement that says, I worked for just 3 days on this presentation. The question to ask is the month-long presentation 10 times better than the 3-day presentation? Even without looking at the presentation, even without knowing how good or bad a presentation should be, you know that the month-long presentation can't be 1,000 times better than a 3-day presentation. It might be twice better, maybe. And if you looked at the presentation side by side, would you know which one took 1 month and which one took 3 days? There's a pretty good chance you wouldn't be able to tell the difference. Which tells us that my boast was just making me feel better, but it was chewing through a lot of time and a lot of energy. This is a good problem. You take a month to do something, now you have just 3 days to do it. Can you make such a big leap? No, you can't. But you can do it in stages, which is why I set myself the goal of creating a presentation in a week's time. Not surprisingly, I take all week to finish the presentation. And while it was a bit rocky to begin with, I was able to create presentation after presentation in a week's time instead of taking a whole month. And then, for some reason, I ran into a crazy deadline. I had just 24 hours to complete an entire presentation. I worked hard, much too hard, which meant that I was like a zombie on the morning of the presentation. Going from 1 month to a week to a day sounds like a dream, but it was relatively a nightmare. And what I found was that around 3 to 4 days, that's kind of nice. I can get most of it done in 3 to 4 days because now that kind of limitation creates a deadline for me. I don't really have a choice. And this kind of answers the question, how do I self-impose deadlines? I think it's the self-limitation. It's how do I do this in the next 3 or 4 days? Or how do I do this in half the time? This kind of behavior also prevents that perfection syndrome. If my clients, my wife, and even I can't tell the difference between a 3-day and a month-long presentation, then we have a problem, don't we? And this is not just for when you're executing something, when you're creating a presentation, when you're writing a book. When you're learning a skill as well, you have the same kind of situation. At Psychotactics, we have the article writing course, and clients know what they want their article to look like, but it's clearly impossible to write an article that meets with their expectations. After all, you're just starting out. You're just starting to learn the structure, the rhythm, the pace, constructing the stories. You're just starting out. You know what your article needs to look like, but you can't write with such finesse, structure, and speed right at the beginning. That doesn't stop them, does it? They do what city planners do. They put in more time. They spend more time editing, writing. They spend 200% or 300% more time. And of course, you don't get a 300% better result. Instead, you might get a 2% better article. Or you might end up so exhausted that the whole feeling is worse than expected. The article is worse than expected. Your dread is greater. The frustration is greater. And that's because an article has so many elements. So you have to break up that exercise into many tiny increments. So you write the topics on one day, do the outline on the next, and then you write on the third. And this is the whole fine balance that we have between limits and ability. You can't take a month-long presentation and boil it down to 3 days overnight, but you can go through tiny increments, reducing it a little bit. And then what you find is you're starting to get faster. So you don't get better, you actually stay at the same spot in terms of quality of work, but you start to get faster. And then you have more breathing space. And when you have more breathing space, you can see the mistakes you're making. You can see the mistakes that other people are making and how you can fix them in your own work. And you start to get better. When you look at people who say, I'm busy, I'm so busy, usually what it means is they're not restricting themselves. They're not trying to do that same task in a shorter amount of time. Because when you do it in a shorter amount of time, you have to learn shortcuts. You have to learn how to do that very same thing in a completely different way. You have to have more planning. You have to do or approach everything in a way that you've never done before. If you're busy all the time, there is something completely wrong with the way you're approaching things. We all get this lecture about how we need to be more productive. No, we don't. We need to have oodles of time to waste. We need to be able to spend a couple of hours drinking coffee, 2 hours having lunch if we need to. We need to spend all of that time enjoying our lives. It's maddening that you and I are sitting at a computer for 1 month when we could finish it in 3 days and have all of that extra time. And when you have all these limitations, all of the other things come into play as well. You realize, okay, these are my bad energy zones, these are my medium energy zones, these are my high energy zones, and you start to use them more effectively. You don't have that much of a problem with discipline because you already have a deadline. You have a very short deadline, and now you've got to deliver. At which point people say, I can't handle the pressure. Of course you can't handle the pressure. You can't go from 1 month to 3 days tomorrow, but you can go from 1 month to 20 days, 1 month to 15 days, 1 month to 10 days, 1 month to 5 days. And you'll be stunned when you realize that instead of 1 month, you're taking 3 days. You have to create limitations. If you don't create limitations, you're just inefficient and, of course, busy all the time, exhausted all the time. There's a problem there. We need to fix it. That brings us to the end of this podcast. We covered 3 things, and we kind of summarized it a minute ago, but here we go again. The first thing is the energy black holes. You're not going to get much done in these black holes. So do your research, do all of that planning that you need to do in those black holes, or just go to sleep for 20 minutes, go to sleep for an hour. Maybe you feel groggy after a sleep, so go and do something which is not so intensive. And then you have the in-between ones, and you know what to do with the high-octane zones. So managing your energy is crucial, but planning which activity goes into which section, that is even more important. You just show up there and go, I'm going to do stuff. No, it's not going to happen. You have to allocate. This high-octane activity goes here, and this thing goes into that little black hole there. So that's the first thing. The second issue was discipline versus deadlines. And we all struggle, especially with internal deadlines. But the point is that a lot of people who say that or seem like they're disciplined are really meeting a deadline. All of those writers, all of those dancers, all of those singers, all of those pianists, and in everyone, all those business people, I know I'm going on and on. The point is that they're just meeting a deadline. They're just as lazy as you and me. No one is self-motivated, believe me. The motivation comes from the deadline. When you go, how am I supposed to create a deadline for things that I want to do? And I guess there's a limitation. It's difficult. Anything that you want to do, that's driven by you. There's nobody else pushing you. So the limitation is what you've got to create. And that's kind of what I had to do. I had to go from making this month-long drama of a presentation into a week and then 3 days. And you go, how did you decide that? I don't know. I just did. I know the reason. I had a bunch of webinars that came back to back and they were a week apart, so I had no choice but to do it. And that's how I learned. It wasn't my idea. It was just this whole situation where I had to present week after week. That's how I figured it out. And then I had this crazy one where I had to do it in 24 hours. And I go, oh, that's too much. So I don't know, sometimes you just get lucky with bad organization, and that's how you learn what you can really do. That brings us to the end of this podcast. Let's find out what's happening in psychotactics land. If you listened to the last podcast, it was about the Stockdale paradox and how optimists don't do so well. So what are the realists doing? The realists realize that nothing's going to change in the short term. Nothing's going to change in the middle term. That whatever we're going through right now, it's going to go on for quite a while. And even when that dust settles, it's going to go on for a while more. And what's going to happen in between is we've got to somehow pretend that we're back in university, that this is going to take a year or 2 years or whatever it is. We don't know. And the way I look at it is, how do I educate myself? How do I get better at what I do? How do I get faster at what I do? Now, there is an ulterior motive here. We've got products and we've got services, and we're telling you to educate yourself because you have to pay for something. But that's the reality of the situation. When we started out in marketing, or even much later and even now, we invest in stuff that helps us to get better, helps our clients to get better results, and as a result, we get paid for it. Now, you don't have to go and buy expensive products from Psychotactics. There are smaller products. So if you go to psychotactics.com/tiny, so that's psychotactics.com/tiny, you'll get a whole range of products that are not $1,000 or $2,000, but something more within your range. And you can fix those problems and improve them, or improve your website, or improve your sales process. So go to psychotactics.com/tiny. But I think the best value for your money is going to be 5000 BC. And the reason for that is, yes, we have this time. We're still kind of busy doing what we're not sure of. But 5000 BC has a forum, and it has me in that forum because I'm not going on any vacation. And you can ask questions and get answers. And if you don't know the questions, we'll prompt you with the questions. The point is that there is not going to be a better time when you have so much space to fix things, to improve things, to learn things. And that's why I would suggest you either go to psychotactics.com/tiny and do a little self-study yourself, or take all of that information, go into 5000 BC, and then work with it. This podcast that we've done, the question was asked by Akash Thakkar. And Akash asked this question in 5000 BC, and I wrote this entire piece of energy, deadlines, all of this stuff in response to his question. Has it made him better? I think so. Will it make you better? I think so. So join us in 5000 BC, and we'll see you there in 5000 BC land. Bye for now. Still listening? This whole coronavirus thing means that, at least in New Zealand, we can't do anything. Since about end of March, we've had nothing open except for groceries and supermarkets. We're not even encouraged to get into a car and go a kilometer away, which is about half a mile. Not encouraged. What if the car breaks down? What if you have an accident? Other people have to get in there and help you. So all of our activity is pretty much within 20 minutes of the house. And we're talking about walking. We're not talking about driving for 20 minutes. And this has been a real pain because I really enjoy that downtime sitting at the cafe, talking to people. And we've had to recreate that cafe situation. So Renuka and I now spend that time, maybe like a coffee break, almost like a corporate now. We have like a 10 o'clock coffee break, and then we have a 4 o'clock coffee break. And that's where the Bialetti comes into play. And it's constantly getting stuck. And we can't get any replacement right now because nothing is being delivered online. Nothing that I know of anyway. So it's interesting, but we've got to recognize those low energy zones, those high energy zones. And even in a situation like this where we don't know what's going to happen next or how it's going to happen next, but keeping yourself motivated, not too optimistic, but just, this is what I have to do. This is the job that I've been given. This is the role that I've been given, and doing it. That's really what gets us through this. I'll say bye for now and see you in 5000 BC. Bye-bye. Oh, and this was recorded at 4:30 a.m., which is when I'm in my high energy zone. Bye. Really, I'm going now.